So one of the things that we actually have come across a lot as well with our customers is we ring them and the first thing they say to us is, what actually is HVO? So I don't know if you want to say from your perspective what you know from when you guys signed up to actually using HVO.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? As HVO, it's an odd name for something because it stands for hydrotreated vegetable oil. You can understand why they shortened it, and it doesn't really help, does it, when somebody says, well, it's hydrotreated vegetable oil, of course, and you think, yeah, but what's that? Well, I suppose the important thing is it is a direct substitute for diesel, and if there's one thing you remember, that's it. But it's actually kind of an idealised diesel. So what happens is it's got feedstocks, which are all renewable. So instead of being made from fossil fuels, which have sort of bound carbon in the ground for millennia and releasing that carbon as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, what we're actually using things like waste cooking oil, we're using plant materials, and they actually, in a relatively short period of time, have actually absorbed CO2 from the atmosphere in their creation. So they are a hydrocarbon. They've got the same almost chemical constituency as diesel, but the carbon in there has only been in there a short time. So when we burn it, we release that carbon back to atmosphere. So out of the tailpipe, we still produce CO2.
Yeah.
But the important thing is that hydrotreated vegetable oil actually takes CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So except for a small amount, which actually we need to use to create the hydrogen, the hydrotreated vegetable oil and the processes, which actually accounts for about 10%, we end up with actually a net well-to-wheel carbon saving of about 90%.
Yeah, because you're at the moment currently using the bulk supply from GBF, which is an acquisition of Certas Energy.
Yeah.
So when was it that you started using HVO?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think it was about 2018. So around that time, we were really starting to learn more about HVO and its potential as an alternative to diesel. It was becoming more readily available. One of the first events we really used it on was a ride and drive event at Millbrook. So we were there for 3 weeks essentially with lots of trucks, lots of customers, and we were very conscious of the environmental impact of an event like that, where essentially we're just driving round and round in circles, with operators having a nice experience, but we weren't really taking anything anywhere very meaningful. So it was kind of nice to offset some of the carbon impact by making sure that the trucks were running on HVO. And since then, really, we've been using wherever we have the opportunity, we'll use HVO. But of course, the beauty of HVO is when the trucks are off and maybe we deliver them to an operator who's running up and down through Scotland. The beauty with HVO is you can flip back to diesel without any consequence, but it's nice to do on it.
Yeah, just a straight drop-in replacement. So a lot of people initially say that HVO, the reason they want to switch over to it is because it is up to 90% reduction in the emissions. But was there any other reasoning that made you consider HVO or anything else that stood out that you guys thought, right, that's the right decision for us to use going forward?
I think it was primarily the carbon reduction, the well-to-wheel carbon reduction. But also it is practically it's quite good for us actually having a Bowser on site. We could have had a diesel tank on site, of course, but inevitably, because there's diesel down the road, you kind of rely on the fuel stations. But then, it's another job. So actually, the sort of unintended benefit was by investing in a tank and having a supply on site just makes it a little bit more efficient as well. So
a few people I know that like to use it because not only has it got that carbon reduction over the product life cycle, but it's also how much safer it is to use. So being biodegradable.
Certain operators, we've had feedback that the drivers really like the cleanliness of the diesel. So it's the HVO. So compared to diesel, which is obviously very smelly, you have to have gloves on all the time. And we'd still recommend you wear gloves when you're filling up with HVO. But the fact that it doesn't smell, so if it gets on your clothing or anything like that, you don't smell like diesel all the time. So that's kind of a very nice thing.
If HVO wasn't an option, do you think that you would have had a tank outside at all, or do you think that it might have been...
Not with diesel, no. I think the ready availability of conventional diesel would have made it less of a motivation. But yeah, the environmental concerns and what we would have had to put into place to make sure that, you know, if there was any spillages and things like that, would probably have deterred us. So I think HVO made that a much easier decision.
What is it that the sort of feedback that you're getting from those customers when you're talking to them about HVO?
We've transitioned a little bit. When we first started talking about it, sort of 5-6 years ago, people weren't aware of it, and people couldn't believe there was such a readily available alternative to diesel with really almost none of the operational downsides. The only, you know, elephant in the room, if you like, is the cost of it, and of course initially was availability of HVO. The conversation has shifted now, I think. So people are aware of it. They've read about it in the press. They've perhaps heard of other people using it, but they probably haven't dug deep into the differences.
It is intriguing to see how many more people are putting out tender opportunities and actually want to see that you are going and using HVO and that initiative's being taken.
Yeah, we see that as well with obviously some of the bigger fleets, the fleets perhaps serving some of the high street chains, that they've been very aware of their carbon emissions and carbon footprint across their entire business for some years. But some of the hauliers who work for those people are now being brought into scope because those end users, those high street brands, are demanding that their supply chains are green, you know, and so anybody maybe just running a couple of vehicles but working on behalf of some of these high street chains are being asked to come up with environmental initiatives. And, you know, they might not be in a position to be able to go out and buy an electric truck, but they can certainly start to put HVO in the fuel tank.
One thing that I noticed was how important it actually is when considering who you're going to use to supply your HVO. So obviously you started with GBF, one of our acquisitions for Certas Energy. So what was that sort of decision-making process? Was that something you took into consideration with who you were going to choose to supply your HVO?
Yes, well, we sought assurances really to ensure that you know, we weren't actually taking any sort of virgin palm oil feedstocks. I've been convinced since that, you know, any palm oil feedstocks or materials that go into the HVO that we take is actually sort of byproducts, if you like, and it's not coming from newly planted palm oil plantations, which of course you know, lead to lots of deforestation and environmental damage. So the last thing we want to do in shifting to a renewable is cause another environmental disaster somewhere else. So yeah, I mean, and now of course we use the assurance scheme, which is quite handy. So operators who are looking at HVO but want to make sure that they're actually sourcing it from a reliable supplier, they need to be asking the question about the assurance scheme and making sure that there's traceability in terms of the feedstocks, because that is an important consideration, you know, over and above, you know, how the fuel is actually used in their fleet.
Yeah, so we've got Certas Energy has the Zemo partnership, and I didn't realise how easy it would actually be just to view who are Zemo partners.
Yeah.
So Zemo partnership is obviously the ones running the fuel assurance scheme to make sure that it's all ethically sourced and then ecologically viable and everything, and that it's from the primary sources as well, rather than going through different distribution, and it's followed to that end user.
Yep.
And all an audible trail, making sure that there isn't palm oil in those sources and it is done through an ethically sourced way. One of the other bits that I was looking into was how it's done by the other accreditations that can be gained. And there is actually a checklist of how you can check who your supplier is and follow through to ensure that we've got it on our website as well to help anyone that's a bit unsure on who to go to, because it can be such an issue with people then claiming the sustainability credentials or their carbon and then not understanding where that actual HVO has come from.
Whenever we get a delivery, we get a certificate so we can see where the feedstocks have come from. And of course, we know that, you know, due to seasonal variations and market changes, that those feedstocks can change on a global basis. And I think that can, for some operators, be a reason why they perhaps have stuck with using FAME biodiesel, because typically FAME biodiesel can be small-scale production, and that enables people, particularly in the food retail industry to be able to reuse some of their own raw materials. So they've got that traceability, which of course HVO is made on such large scales that you couldn't necessarily do that. So having the assurance scheme is another way of ensuring that you're actually, you're making sure that the complete supply chain, as you say, is traceable, and so you can know where the feedstocks come from.
Have you ever taken HVO at one of the bunker sites and refueling? Because I know that you've got.
No, that's a new one for us, and we will be doing, I'm sure, in due course. But obviously, we do try and, for obvious reasons, try to fill up at base where we can. But I'm sure there will be opportunities.
I think because we've tried scaling up so much, we've went from sort of half the amount of HVO sites that we did have at the start of the year, about a year ago, to now having 13, only having Dumfries recently brought on board with HVO with a new conversion. But we are very careful with our conversions. We won't just sort of have an old tank and then just put HVO. We have to clear it out, make sure that everything's tip-top before we'd put HVO in it, to then make sure that our end users are getting exactly what they expect and following the whole fuel assurance scheme, and it's all like audited and so on. But I think there's still that awareness piece that people are sort of learning. Where are those locations? Where can I access them? And with it being still new to the industry and getting things right and educating people about what HVO is, we are still in that process.
But you may also make a good point about obviously cleaning the tanks as well. So I mean, that is, if somebody is planning to use existing tanks that they might have for storage, then obviously you would hope that their supplier would recommend to make sure that the filters are clean and the tanks are clean before you switch over from diesel to HVO, to make sure you're just not picking up any contamination from that previous fuel, which you might inadvertently think, oh, that's to do with the HVO, and of course it's not. It's actually just the residue of the previous fuel that's been in there. So I suppose that's good practice. But yeah, I can just reassure them HVO's dead easy to use. It's so flexible. It doesn't commit you. So if you've got a business, a customer that's really looking for that lowest carbon footprint today, and you switch your whole fleet to HVO and you commit all the way down the road to it, if the situation changes and you need to be have different priorities in your business, then you switch back to diesel if you have to. But it doesn't commit you in any way. It has that flexibility, which in this sort of period at the moment where we're transitioning from conventional diesel all the way through to zero emission solutions, that's a really nice attribute for the fuel to have.
Definitely. I think one good thing about it as well is it being a straight drop-in replacement. So especially if you already have supply from a accredited supplier from the fuel assurance scheme, if you have standard diesel, you can put it straight into one of the tanks.
Well, I suppose it'd be interesting to know from your perspective, how many is your ambition to eventually have HVO pretty much all of your locations? What do you think the ambition is?
So we've got 27 core bunker sites at Certas Energy. We've currently got 13 of them now, with Dumfries recently coming on board. So what we are hoping to increase that. We have a few more in the sort of pipeline that we want to spread out to. We've got 3 obviously in Scotland, then we've got it tailing all the way down to Southampton and Portsmouth, and then we've got Cannock at the Hollies truck stop as well in the Midlands. So we've got quite a spread now, making it easily much better and more accessible, and also being able to plan people's routes and help them with that, to say if they're going from A to B, where would they stop off for HVO, where would they need to go. Even anyone with a bulk tank, if you go in across country and you need to top up along the way, that's something that we can then facilitate. We do work with a wider network as well, so I think overall in the UK there is now actually 44 sites that you can get HVO from for HGVs. So with working with them and wider, there is quite a wide network, and it is only just increasing. So we're hoping within a month or so we'll be bringing on another site. So it's gone quite quickly, but yeah, more and more are being brought on board.
Yeah, and that just brings that flexibility piece in play again, doesn't it? Because it means that you can you don't have to divert off route. You can just top up whenever it's convenient, wherever with HVO. So that will just take away one of those last remaining hurdles to adoption of HVO. And I think, it's only going to grow in importance. I think it's got a momentum now, and I think operators that don't use HVO and are perhaps dealing with customers who are looking for environmental benefits are going to struggle really to justify why they continue operating diesel. So I think the momentum is going in the right direction, and I think it's a good thing for transport. It's a good thing for the environment.
Have you seen anything, an impact on your trucks? Because there's suggestions and people talking about, obviously we know that it can actually be better for the filters, cleaner, and that when they are coming to services and the injectors, it is a lot better for them. So have you seen an impact on that as well?
It's difficult to pin that down. Not least because we do, even in our trucks that we fuel with HVO, they get occasionally filled up with diesel, and that's going to happen. So I wouldn't say it's easy to sort of give you any sort of empirical evidence, but I would say anecdotally and from our experience, running on HVO is less troublesome. We know the principles of the way the fuel burns. It doesn't generate as much soot, so therefore the exhaust after treatment system is going to take longer to clog, so that can lead to a improvement in sort of operational life of the after treatment system, but also potentially a fuel economy saving. And also because there's less oxygen in HVO than there is in conventional diesel, that leads to lower levels of NOx. And the indirect impact of that is the truck will probably burn less AdBlue as well.
I think one of the misconceptions is that so it's practically flame-free. You have sulfur and fossil-free. So it means without those nitrous oxides, as well as the particulate matter, that's when it's burning through, means that you have less of those risks. You don't need as many of those additives that people do add with diesel. It doesn't have those those issues. So when it is then burning, it technically does burn smoother and cleaner, meaning that things like filters and your injectors, when it comes to servicing them, are usually in better condition. So it's a logical assumption that is built off.
Absolutely, we believe that, and I think where we've seen operators shift to hydrotreated vegetable oil HVO, they've seen, if they have had any problems, they've seen the frequency of those problems definitely dip down.
What trucks can use HVO, will it void the warranty, and is there any issues surrounding that?
Well, I can reassure you that in terms of HVO operation, essentially all DAF trucks can run on it, and in terms of warranty, there's no implications there. There's sometimes a little bit of confusion because whilst older vehicles we can formally approve to run on HVO, and the latest vehicles from about 2017 onwards, we can formally approve those for the use on HVO. When the Euro 6 emissions legislation came into force around about 2012, 2013, the legislation for Euro 6 said that any manufacturer approving a particular fuel for their vehicles had to make sure that truck had been tested to the emission standards running on those fuels, and those earlier Euro 6 models weren't actually tested against HVO operations. So there's a kind of a gap in our ability to approve early Euro 6 vehicles in a formal sense, but even those trucks, they won't suffer from the use of them, and we know many operators who run their vehicles on HVO, and actually they will benefit in the same way as we've discussed before in terms of the cleaner burning fuel, reducing the amount of impact. There are no impacts on maintenance intervals or scheduled maintenance intervals, and there's no concerns really if the HVO is blended or mixed with the fuel, either by sort of mixing it in the tank or sort of filling from different sources. You can run 100% HVO, or you can be 0% HVO the next day, or you can mix it in the tank. So that any of those sort of blending situations are equally, that they don't have any impact. So that and that's where people did perhaps have those concerns, because when you're running a truck maybe using some of the FAME biodiesel, there were strict limits there on the amount of the percentage and implications for maintenance intervals and warranties and things like that, which, as I say, don't exist when you're operating HVO.
It's interesting to hear, because I think there just is this perception that it could cause an issue with a warranty. So it's nice to have that confirmation and give that confidence that HVO is not going to cause any of that damage to the vehicle. If there was an issue, it would be something outside of that.
Yeah.
And that DAF have said themselves that you can use it in those DAF trucks.
Yeah.
And that there is those benefits to them. Is there anything that you would see as a negative to HVO?
No, not really. I mean, the issues I mentioned before, there's two potential downsides. One is it costs more typically to buy HVO. But I think for many operators, they see the benefit of running that, so they're prepared to pay a cost premium because of the environmental benefits, which might be a direct benefit for themselves. But particularly it will be for their customers. So customers are increasingly looking at what they're calling their Scope 3 CO2 emissions, which are the emissions really for delivery and collection of goods and things like that. So those customers are looking for their hauliers to provide lower carbon transport solutions, and of course this gives that operator that potential. For some operators, it might be the unique selling point that wins them additional business or retains business. So HVO has a value in its use, and that, as I say, for the operators who using HVO, they obviously feel that that value outweighs any cost premium that are having to pay for fuel at the pump. And then the other issue has been availability. Obviously, we, like many operators, have our own on-site bowsers, so we can fill our own tanks. That's absolutely fine. But of course, out on the road, there has been a concern that there hasn't been HVO readily available. The flexibility to be able to switch back to diesel makes that it's not really an operational issue.
Yeah.
But now, of course, it's really encouraging to know that there's an increase in network of bunkered HVO around the country that operators can tap into. So there's no real reason now where your entire journey can't be sort of fully fueled by HVO.
100%. I think for price, what we've seen though as well is initially people don't realise that there's no upfront cost to HVO. So there's no modifications that you need to make to your truck. Yeah. There's nothing that needs to happen. You don't need to change an infrastructure. You can simply fill up and go on HVO because you don't have to change all of your fleet over to HVO to reduce your carbon emissions. If you changed over 1 in 8 trucks, for example, it gives you a chance to actually put in those costs and then work out over your whole fleet the actual difference in that pricing. So we've essentially created that so people can work that out, and rather than saying that one truck has that cost impact to it from HVO, when you spread it across a fleet, the increase at the moment isn't that much, and knowing that cost is coming down the more that availability increases in the UK, it is reassuring to know that there is that solution.
That also can help operators balance the cost. So if they're afraid of a big cost premium moving from diesel to HVO, then if they split their fills and they say only fill half of the time with HVO, they're still going to get a 45% CO2 benefit, which is massive in the scale of things. You're almost halving the amount of CO2 emitted to atmosphere, but with only half that cost premium. So you can judge it, and maybe operating for certain end users are much more environmentally friendly. Maybe operate those vehicles or those routes on HVO, whilst you still, if you've got cost concerned customers who don't want to pay a premium, you can still run your fleet on diesel, and those vehicles are completely flexible. So it does give lots of flexibility. And when we're looking at the big environmental challenge, we've got to remember, the earlier we have any interventions into carbon emissions, the more effective they will be. If we leave things to the last minute, then, of course, climate change will have moved on a pace, and actually reversing any climate implications will be much more difficult the longer they go on. So the sooner we can intervene and actually start to use renewables, the better. And that's why I think HVO has a really important environmental place to play, not just within individual fleets, but in society's terms, in terms of being able to move away from dependence on fossil fuels.
one of the other things I wanted to ask as well is if you had one of your customers was sort of unsure whether their truck could be used. I know that we're talking about it now, and you've assured us that that's fine. But is there somewhere that they can go or somewhere they can speak to just to double check or have that conversation to gain that confidence in?
Yeah, they should be able to. Obviously, they can go to a DAF dealer. A DAF dealer hopefully knows there are documents available online which go into lots of details about all sorts of alternative fuels that are available and how much they can use in which engines. So it's all detailed. It's a bit of a document. I think the challenge with any operator, sometimes if they pick up the phone to the dealer, they need to speak to somebody who's quite knowledgeable about it. We do a lot to educate our dealers to make sure that they do have this information, but if there's any uncertainty, they can always contact us at head office, and inevitably the question comes to me or to one of my colleagues, and we should be able to answer that question. But if they go to our website, there are generic comments on there and support for HVO. So actually, if you go onto our website and you start looking on there at our strategy for future vehicles, you'll see that HVO is definitely one of our approaches. Alongside hydrogen, alongside battery electric, HVO is one of the routes that we encourage people to consider.
What about if you'd spoken to someone that hadn't yet used HVO and was unsure about it? What would you recommend how to start or get in touch, or what would you start off with for HVO?
Well, I think a good starting point would be obviously to talk to them a little bit about how they currently refuel. Have they got their own on-site tank that could be used for HVO? Start to also understand about what's their motivation, because if they're doing it because they think they're going to save money, then they need to be aware that actually that probably isn't the main objective. So starting to get them thinking about how the benefits of HVO might translate into improved business relationships with their customers and things like that. But the thing, of course, is go to the market. Obviously talk to Certas, but there's a number of different suppliers out there, and that's a good thing. So it means that people can actually make sure that they're talking to a supplier. Check price, check availability, check the knowledge as well of the supplier, because you do want to make sure that you're talking to somebody who knows about HVO. And we've just been talking about it, the assurance scheme. Make sure that any suppliers you're talking to have got that traceability in place, so that you can be assured that you're buying HVO from an ethical supply chain.
When it goes in, it has that instant reduction in CO2 emissions because it's across the whole product life cycle, rather than putting in something that is just an end use. So it's not just what comes out the tailpipe, it is from the well to wheel.
Absolutely.
So people often don't realise that the second they have switched to that purchase of HVO, they are getting that reduction in those CO2 emissions. So one thing we actually did was tested it ourselves. So we're not necessarily going to say to everyone, use HVO if we haven't tested and seen the sort of benefits ourselves, as we take that responsibility on as well. So many of our actual own tankers that deliver HVO into those tanks are actually running on HVO themselves. So we started off with a tester, I think, into 2021, and we changed 2 of our depots. So we changed them running on standard diesel over to HVO, and I think we'd reduced our CO2 emissions by over 6,000 tonnes of CO2.
Absolutely.
What we've even expanded on now is that we actually are bringing in HVO to our retail sites. So it's been branded and called Evo Ultra. So we're even trying to encourage people on the domestic side as well, that they'll have an option to actually be able to fill up with HVO. But then being able to make that contribution with HVO on the road is going to make it more accessible and easier for the public, members of the public as well.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. I'm glad to hear that. I wasn't aware of that, but it is good. I think, the benefits of HVO, they can be felt by cars, vans, other types of vehicles. And if you can make that available, it will help, clean up some of those older, dirtier cars, which will inevitably be in the vehicle park for some time. And particularly in urban environments, we know that NOx and particulates are really quite damaging. And switching to HVO, it can have an immediate effect on tailpipe, and it should also lead to more reliable cars as well, because you're going to get less of the build-up of soot and the need to regenerate particle filters and things like that, which particularly with older vehicles can be quite troublesome. So it could be a way that people could environmentally sort of make over their vehicle fleet.
Yeah, it's even with other businesses. I know we've touched on sort of HGVs being able to use it on the road for domestic customers as well, but we've obviously got that you guys are using them yourselves, the bulk use. There is that delivery that's offered nationwide, so the access to it is becoming more available, easier to source, and even anyone that just wants to call us and have a chat about it, because there is so many questions when it's your own fleet or your own car or anything like that, that we are understandable that people have questions they want to check for themselves, and that is something that our team will always help by. We have some great specialists in HVO that really understand the fuel, how we can get the fuel to you, what's the best way. Is it through bulk deliveries? Is it something that you don't necessarily want to give up all your diesel, so you'd like to see what other on the road usage there is, so you could get both HVO and diesel? That's something that our team are always happy to help with. So I just wanted to say as well, thank you for letting us all come and visit DAF. It's been really good to go over HVO and everything, and it would be good to take a look around.
Yeah, and great to host you. It's a great topic. You can see I quite like HVO, so it's been very enlightening to hear about Certas are doing, and encouraging to see how you're sort of breaking down the barriers to the adoption of the fuel as a more general use in UK freight.